After 3 months living in the garage, I finally completed the work to restore my Rob Roy, and I'd like to spend the next couple of minutes sharing with you the projects that have been undertaken in the past 3 years to bring her back to like new condition. The boat came to me with quite a bit of cracking in the gel coat along the entire surface of the hull, and rather than try to fix that myself, I hired the folks at White Mountain Fiberglass in Rumney, New Hampshire to strip her down and refinish the entire hull. In the process, I learned that the boat was originally gel coated green, later it was painted white, and then she was painted green again. I also found out that the boat at one point had quite a few repairs done to her hull, which were failing, and that was the cause of the cracking that we were now seeing in the gel coat. To fix this, all the old repairs had to be painstakingly ground out and then individually built up with fiberglass cloth and ultimately faired in with epoxy putty, and then she would be ready for priming and painting. And I have to admit, she turned out better than I could ever have hoped for. Other than having about 30 years of bottom paint applied to her, the hull was in good shape and cleaned up quite nicely after Pat stripped her down and then repainted her with a hard epoxy bottom paint. The next area that needed some TLC was the rudder. The original rudder was an aluminum core with foam wrapped in fiberglass, and over time that aluminum core had dissolved and left the rudder unsupported and able to swing freely left and right. Rather than repairing the original rudder, I decided it would be best to start from scratch and make a new one. The new one has a core of G10 with marine plywood laminated on either side and 17 pounds of lead cast in its tip to weight it down. The rudder was then wrapped in fiberglass, primed, barrier coated, and painted with bottom paint. To start this spring's projects off, my brother came up and helped me remove the old bow roller and install the shiny new Mantis BR1 bow roller along with the 17-pound M2 anchor. I was really pleased with how well the anchor fit in the bow roller and how simple it's going to be to tie the anchor off when it's not in use. Now comes the tedious part. I removed all the hardware from the deck and the cabin top and proceeded to grind out these zillions of stress cracks which has occurred over the years. The majority of the cracks appeared around where hardware was mounted, and when I looked into it, I found that most of the hardware did not have an adequate backing plate, and that's what resulted in the cracking. The cracks were then filled with Thicko, a flexible, thickened epoxy that's sold by Jamestown distributors. As a precaution against water entering the bolt holes, I over-drilled the bolt holes, filled them with epoxy, re-drilled through the epoxy, and tapered them. I also added G10 backing plates to the deck and cabin top where hardware would be mounted to lessen the likelihood of water seeping in underneath them. After what seemed like an eternity of filling, more fairing, and constant sanding, I was able to lay down 2 coats of epoxy primer. Mike rejoined me and helped me put down 3 coats of paint using the Epiphan's 2-part polyurethane in Light Oyster. The finish was extraordinary, and this was all done by rolling the paint on with no tipping whatsoever. The next step was to tape off the areas for the non-skid. I decided to use a product called Soft Sand as the non-skid substrate and encapsulate it in 3 coats of the 2-part Epiphan's polyurethane paint that I had used on the deck and cabin. I took this opportunity to replace much of the original equipment that came with the boat. I installed a bank of spin-lock rope clutches, a deck organizer, new chain plates, jib tracks, and cars, as well as a midship cleat. Garhauer Marine fabricated a new stainless steel mast tabernacle to replace the original one, which was badly cracked along the weld points. I also installed a fan to aid in ventilation, as well as a new plug for the masthead lights. One of the shortcomings with the Cockpit in the Rob Roy was that there was no place to put your beverages. To remedy this, I fabricated the teak cover, which covers the motor, allows me a place to put my drink, and also has hatches which can open up to allow the motor to properly breathe and prevent it from stalling out. Another change I made was to lengthen the tiller and install an autopilot. For a 23-footer, the Rob Rory has an amazing amount of storage on either side of the motor well as well as under the cockpit seats. The last update to the cockpit was to paint the bilges and install an automatic bilge pump which resides underneath the cockpit sole. I consulted with John Drake of Drake Marine Services as to what type of electronic package I should install on the boat. He recommended the B&G brand as they specialize in sailing instruments, and I decided to go with the Vulcan 9 touchscreen chart plotter, a Triton 2 display, the wireless wind sensor, as well as a transducer that provides depth, speed, and temperature readings. For communications, I opted for the B&G V50 radio. This provides DSC capability as well as receives AIS signals from vessels who are transmitting. One of my pet peeves is having random wires and cables dangling around the boat. So when the boat was rewired, I took great pains to keep the electronic installation neat and tidy. The inside of the cabin got a makeover. I painted the bilge with a 2-part epoxy paint, as well as the forward area where the anchor rod is stowed. The biggest change were the floorboards. I replaced the old, worn-out teak and holly plywood with solid white oak quarter sawn floorboards. The trim, the bulkheads, and the various teak components were coated with 4 coats of varnish, bright on the trim and satin on the flat areas. In the galley, I installed a gimbaled Origno alcohol stove, a holder to contain the cups, plates, and silverware, as well as a brass oil lamp my brother gave me. To starboard is the sink, which has a brass hand pump that is plumbed into a 13-gallon water tank. And that brings you up to date on the projects that I've done on the boat over the past 3 years. This winter, I'll be working on interior, exterior cushions, a new sail for the mizzen, and then next year, we'll be sailing our brains out. Thanks for watching.